The Secrets of Star Wars is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
You're listening to Secrets of Star Wars, episode 35.
Hello there.
It's a power that Jedi have that lets them control people and make things float.
Impressive. Every word in that sentence was wrong.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
It's against my programming to impersonate a deity.
That's not how the Force works.
Force is with me, and I am with the Force, and I fear nothing.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.
Hey everybody, I'm Father Andrew Kinstetter, aka Father Fett, and you're listening to the Secrets of Star Wars, where we talk about everything connected to that galaxy far, far away. Today we're beginning our discussion on all the connections and lore of the Mandalorian culture, and we're beginning with the animated series The Clone Wars. And specifically, we're talking about Season 2, Episodes 12, 13, and 14, titled The Mandalore Plot, Voyage of Temptation, and Duchess of Mandalore. And joining me on the panel this evening are, first of all, we have Thomas Sanjurjo. Hey, Thomas.
Hi, Father.
And second, we have Angela Ciolana. Hey, Angela.
Hello there.
Mike Creevy and Andrew Hermes were both unfortunately unable to join us this evening, so we have the trio here tonight. So a few, actually just one point before we kind of jump into it. I was just kind of looking at these episodes, just some stats about them, and just to point out that they were released in January and February of 2010. So we're hitting just about the 10-year release of these particular episodes. So I'll throw it to you guys first, but just kind of what were your initial impressions of this particular story arc? We're going to take these episodes kind of as an arc versus individual episodes.
So this was like a rewatch for me because I love this arc and I've like watched it so many times. As I mentioned in like our first kind of reboot episode, Obi-Wan is my favorite character. And so this arc was like really, really important in learning more about him as a character, as a person, and really kind of humanizing him. So I love it. And I love a lot of the themes that are explored in this episode as well. Oh, and Duchess Satine. How can you not love that? Ewan McGregor kind of like, I know he didn't voice, it was James Arnold Taylor who voices Obi-Wan here, but it's just kind of funny that like Ewan McGregor in Moulin Rouge, his love interest is Satine, and here his love interest is Satine, so pretty funny.
Yeah, I like this episode. It touches on a lot of topics that I'm really interested in, especially nonviolence and nonviolent protest. Going against the system that's demanding that you stand on one side or the other. I really like that it approaches that topic in a really relatable but very profound way. And this show was one of those that just, it amazes me that at where we're at, a 10-year-old show for kids, like really, really for kids, because I think that's a complaint that's lodged against Star Wars a lot, that it's a kids, it's a kids fantasy genre. It's for children, and that's why people get mad about Jar Jar Binks, and it's like, well, it's for kids. That's the point. But when you have something that's for kids that can make such a profound statement as this show, and it did it over and over and over again, and even like right up to the last couple of seasons, it still is speaking really, really big truths in a very profound way. And I love it. And this is one of those great examples of the show doing that.
Yeah. I would totally agree with you. I was telling Thomas and Angela before that I've only seen a relatively small number of Clone Wars episodes, and that was one of the first things going through my mind was, wow, this is heavy. Or the Mandalorians that took their own life versus share their, be able to get the secrets force from them. I was like, okay, yeah, there's some pretty heavy stuff here, but I also enjoyed it. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a really fun one to kind of watch through these and to find out a little bit of his backstory. You kind of get hints at it. I don't know, is his backstory with Satine ever really fleshed out?
No, not fleshed out. We never see any flashbacks or anything like that.
We just know that he and Qui-Gon served her basically for a year sometime in the past.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting because even in my introduction to the Star Wars universe, I started with Episode 2, and so Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon and that whole realm of characters was some that I was really close to. So seeing him through these episodes was really cool to learn a little bit more about him, and then also, Thomas, with some of the things that you brought up. There was a lot of kind of just war theory is what kept going through my head, and so I kind of jotted down a few things with that, and pacifism versus when do you get into the fight, and all of those sorts of themes were super prevalent. So let's jump into the discussion then, and we'll just kind of start with a recap of the episodes. And the first episode, the Mandalore plot, there's just the basic summary is that the rumors have reached the Senate that the leader of the Council of Neutral Worlds, who is Duchess Satine of Mandalore, is secretly building her own army to use against the Republic, and Obi-Wan is sent to investigate to discover the truth. And so General Obi-Wan Kenobi lands on Mandalore and meets with Duchess Satine, and he is first greeted by Prime Minister Almec, who right off the bat asserts that the rumors are false and that Duchess Satine would never turn against the Republic, and she values peace more than her own life. And we learn at this point from Almec that Mandalorians have turned away from their violent past, and that all the warriors were exiled to the moon of Concordia. He also claims that they died out years ago. And at this point, Obi-Wan brings up that he met a man in Mandalorian armor, Jango Fett, and this is where we get the soft retcon, I guess you would call it. Almec asserts that Jango Fett is only a common bounty hunter and that he somehow acquired the armor.
So, but these are unreliable narrators, even at this point. This is like because. Then he pulls up the holocron with like another instance of somebody in Mandalorian battle armor fighting, and they're like, well, that's these other guys that we've been, okay, how much are we going to dodge this bullet?
I tend to believe Almec, but I definitely concede to your point.
I think that there are people that don't want to give up this, this warrior way. And I don't know. I don't think that you have to go so far as to say Jango Fett's not a real Mandalorian to let that be okay, Like he's not Mandalorian and he's exiled, right? And so he's not really Mandalorian anymore, but that doesn't necessarily mean he stole the armor, just that they don't recognize him.
So maybe one thing just to bring up is all of the Mandalorians in this episode look the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Jango Fett obviously does not look like them.
Yes.
And that's very obvious. He also doesn't sound like them. So to me, that just was, when I first watched this, was kind of like, okay, well, maybe George is really making this statement that Jango is not a true Mandalorian. But, then, of course, we're doing this after reviewing the first season of The Mandalorian show.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And in that show, we see that later on in The Mandalorian's history that at least, we know at that point that they say being Mandalorian is not a blood thing. It's a creed thing. So it makes for interesting discussion because you can be on either side of this kind of debate or discussion and still be right, so.
Absolutely. I definitely don't mind the retcon. I don't mind Jango Fett being kicked out. I just don't see that there's like a definitive, like, boom, here's the moment where this absolutely was stated. So I really want to leave room open on either side of that argument for people. And I'm going to bring this up again because this is going to become an issue when we see one of the characters do something that is specifically not supposed to be done by Mandalorians, apparently, and why that's an issue. So,
well, and maybe Jango Fett views himself still as a Mandalorian and is still adhered to the creed that he believes to be what makes him a Mandalorian. So after that little dialogue, Obi-Wan visits with Duchess Satine, and it's immediately made apparent that those two already know each other and have a past. It's at that point that Obi-Wan reveals that there was this Mandalorian saboteur who attacked a Republican cruiser, and Duchess Satine quickly says that wasn't any of her people, and the Mandalorian in question took his own life rather than submit to questioning, so they didn't actually figure out who that was. And there was a little bit of foreshadowing there. I thought that was interesting as I watched through it a couple times. Duchess Satine makes the assertion, she says, every one of my people is as trustworthy as I am. And then immediately, if you notice, Senator Merrick is very uncomfortable with that statement and starts to get defensive.
Yeah.
And
it took the second time through to even notice that.
Yeah, oh man, he looks shady. I was like, that's the guy. That's your guy right there. That's a bing pinpoint on him. That's the one.
Yeah, so then next, Satine invites Obi-Wan to go walk about the city, and then we have a discussion about her commitment to peace and neutrality. And we also get a little bit of more information on the group of Mandalorians who are not committed to peace. Mm-hmm. And she reveals that they are known as Death Watch.
Well, and at this point, too, it's really interesting because this is still, from our perspective as a viewer, her stance is very simplistic. It's no violence, no violence, mm-hmm. no violence. And, it just seems kind of ridiculously adamant about no violence and not getting dragged into things. But we don't see the bigger depth until, the whole series of shows plays out. And so you kind of, at the beginning, you're kind of like, well, why don't you get in the war? You need to get in the war. It's the Federation is bad. And there's more subtlety that goes into it than that, which is really cool. I really like that. The way that they kind of lead us along.
She starts off as what we would consider to be an absolute pacifist.
Mm-hmm. Right.
At least that's how she's portrayed, as nonviolence, no force, never. I keyed in on that very quickly and was like, well, I was sort of agreeing with Obi-Wan that he was kind of saying that she was an idealist and not a realist. Mm-hmm. And it was like, well, I don't know if that's quite how you can approach this. We even watching her throughout these episodes, that gets a bit more nuanced as we go forward. So she clearly recognizes that there's this group of hooligan Mandalorians, as she calls them, called Death Watch, they idolize violence and the warrior ways of the past. And she thinks that they're just a small group, and they have all been tracked back to the moon of Concordia. We have a scene then between Count Dooku, and we find out later it's pre-Vizsla, and we basically learn that the Separatists are in league with Death Watch and have promised to support them to overtake Mandalore. And Count Dooku assures Pre-Vizsla that when the Republic intervenes, it will turn public opinion against the Republic troops, and it will put them all in favor of Death Watch, making Death Watch not this terrorist group, but rather liberators, and help them to overtake Mandalore. And I would just point out that Jon Favreau voices Pre-Vizsla, so that was pretty cool because he also voices Paz Vizsla in The Mandalorian Chapter 3. So we go back to Obi-Wan and Satine, and they continue to discuss the philosophy behind peacekeepers. And this is where Obi-Wan asserts that peacekeepers need to be on the front lines of a conflict, and Satine is adamant that peacekeepers are meant to assure that no conflict arises. And this is where Obi-Wan thinks that her views are idealistic and not realistic. But before they can really do anything else, there's an attack on the plaza by Death Watch.
And she is the first one to run in to check on the people that have fallen, which I thought was very telling against that conversation. It was such a great piece of like character development to see. Nope, even with Obi-Wan there, she's the first one that runs in to like grab the wounded people and start pulling them out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of a flop. You would have assumed that the Jedi would have been the one to do that first. And yet they play off that quite a bit because, it's General Obi-Wan Kenobi, which again sounds very weird for a Jedi to be a general and on the front lines fighting. And I think that there was a comment by Anakin, I think it must have been in the second episode of this arc, where he's telling Satine that we fight for peace.
Right.
And Satine says, oh, that is such a contradiction.
Yeah.
So, an interesting dynamic playing out. So this attack happens on the plaza. The man responsible takes off, and Obi-Wan pursues him, and again he takes his own life rather than be caught. But Satine recognizes when she speaks to him that he is speaking the language of the moon Concordia, and she realizes that that's where they need to go to find who's behind the attack, and tells Obi-Wan that he can't go without her, that she has to go with him, and so they head off to the moon of Concordia.
I mean, they knew that, I don't know if we mentioned this, they knew that it was Death Watch because the symbol of Death Watch was there as a hologram, I guess. And actually, I wanted to mention in the Mandalorian episodes, we were talking about maybe what that symbol was, and we had guessed a few things. But on StarWars.com, it says that that symbol of Death Watch is a Shriek Hawk in full dive. So I guess that was a bird that was common on Mandalore. So just interesting plot or tidbit.
Yeah. So they recognize that it is Death Watch and that they have to go to Concordia, and Satine and Obi-Wan head up there. They are met by Governor Vizsla, and he's the leader there on Concordia. And Obi-Wan decides to go sneak around and have a look and tells Satine to keep Vizsla occupied. And Obi-Wan heads off in a speeder, arrives at a mining facility, and he very quickly discovers that it is not abandoned like Governor Vizsla said, or that they thought it was. And he finds the members of Death Watch down in the mine and is quite quickly captured. I found it interesting that I figured he would use the Force way more. He was captured way too easily in my opinion.
I think he was caught off guard.
Yeah. But it was our assumption around here too that he's just not, I don't know, he just doesn't seem to be fighting to full potential either there. So
maybe he's distracted because of Satine. And I think that's like a theme of this episode arc, actually. Just the idea of attachments and calling and vocation and all that. So we'll get to that at the end, but yeah, I think that kind of plays into it.
Good point.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that. So Obi-Wan gets captured. He's hanging upside down on this conveyor belt that's going to crush him, and while Death Watch operates the machines, and he communicates with Satine while she is with Governor Vizsla, and tells her to come and rescue him.
We get
that was
snarky Obi-Wan at this point.
That was kind of a fun scene too, because she has this earpiece in and she's trying to talk to Governor Vizsla and Obi-Wan without Governor Vizsla knowing that she's talking to Obi-Wan.
Well, she's touching her ear, which was that's what made it funny to me.
Yeah, she manages to convince him that she's not quite feeling well and needs to go for a walk. And so she jumps on a speeder and goes off and enters the mining facility and rescues Obi-Wan. There was another kind of comment or a dialogue exchange there about their different philosophies on being a pacifist or not, and that was kind of interesting because I wrote it down. Because she tells Obi-Wan, she says, "For a man sworn to peace, you take an unseemly pleasure in the injuries of others." And he responds with, "For a woman sworn to nonviolence, you don't seem troubled that I could have been killed back there." So they keep kind of playing those two opposing views off of each other. They then basically have a fight with the members of Death Watch. And this is one of the crucial moments of the whole episode because Governor Vizsla makes the dramatic reveal. And I think, Thomas, this is probably what you were referring to.
He takes his helmet off and like shows who he is, which doesn't make sense for the character. Doesn't make sense, but he wants them to know who he is, so he takes the helmet off. And this goes back to like the question of why is it that the Mandalorian in the series that we've seen recently has to keep his helmet on. And I keep coming back to the fact the only thing I can think of is that it's because he's a foundling. And there's something about him being a foundling that he can't take the helmet off to reveal who he is without being removed from his position as a warrior amongst the Mandalorians. And I don't know. I hope we get more of it. I hope that they really explore this idea because I'm sure that other people have pointed out this fact that the helmet taking off is not an issue for anybody who really is a Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Well, and we saw in the flashbacks in The Mandalorian that Din Djarin was rescued by Death Watch, right? So that would somehow be connected to these members of Death Watch somehow.
Yeah. I tend to think that it must, the don't take your helmet off kind of rule, if it doesn't just apply to Din, then it probably is like some kind of survival rule that they made up like after Mandalore was somehow obliterated by the Empire. So
the Night of 1,000 Tears.
Yeah. So that's my theory, because we have seen like Sabine Wren takes her helmet off all the time in Star Wars Rebels. If Jango is a Mandalorian, he takes his helmet off. So, I tend to think that it has to do with the Mandalorian series has to do with that point in time that they're at.
Yeah.
That could be too, yeah.
Well, and even the other Mandalorians in The Mandalorian, they all seem to be of the same, I guess, the same creed, but like none of them we never saw any of them take off their helmets either.
Right.
So I suspect that it wasn't limited to Din, but probably his clan.
Well, maybe it's one of those like the Jewish Passover tradition of having your shoes on and your loins gird as if you were going to be ready to leave, right?
That's a good point.
Always ready to battle, especially after an event like that where everybody almost is wiped out. Always being ready is really important.
I thought you guys were going to say the big reveal was the Darksaber.
Oh no, that's next, man.
That too.
That's after. That's secondary to taking off the helmet, in my opinion. Then all of a sudden,
yeah, because that's very much next. He pulls out the Darksaber, and very quickly tells Obi-Wan that it was stolen from the Jedi Temple by the Mandalorians during the fall of the Old Republic, and that many Jedi had been killed by the Darksaber. And Angela, I think you know the history a little bit better. The Darksaber was built by a Mandalorian who was a Jedi.
Yeah. It was actually a Vizsla, who was the one who built it, and then it was kept in the Jedi Temple after he died, and then the Vizsla clan actually stole it from the Jedi Temple. So when Pre Vizsla says, "My ancestors stole this from the Jedi Temple," that's what he meant. It was literally his ancestors, the Vizslas. And one thing that I like about this scene is, even though he's a pretty rotten guy, Pre Vizsla, he's very two-faced and stuff, he does uphold this Mandalorian concept of like honor in battle. In other words, he gives Obi-Wan his lightsaber so that Obi-Wan can defend himself in battle against the Mandalorian warriors. So I did like that one aspect of this scene.
Wasn't it at this point too that Satine throws a rock at one of the Mandalorians?
Yeah. Yeah, she hits one of them in the head as they're attacking Obi-Wan. So
yeah, so she's not quite an absolute pacifist.
Yeah.
So we'll get more into that.
Yep.
Pre Vizsla and Obi-Wan have a fight, and it more or less kind of ends with a standoff, and Obi-Wan and Satine manage to escape, and at the very conclusion then of that episode, Obi-Wan concludes that the Separatists must be the ones supporting Death Watch, and Satine doesn't really want to believe that, and the end of the episode says that Obi-Wan and Anakin shows up at this point, and they are going to escort Satine to Coruscant to talk to the Senate.
And Ahsoka's missing, which is I know they do this dip in and out of having her as his Padawan, but it's really interesting that she's missing from this series because as the character develops later, this would have been a really interesting development point for her in this resistance against a government that does not allow you to have a say and doesn't allow you to move your own way through whatever they've decided the path must be.
So you're referring to how the Republic treats the Mandalorians?
Right, right. And I think it would be interesting to see her play off of this whole situation and this character. But we don't get that. We just get the... Which I think is good. I think the interaction between Anakin and Obi-Wan is really important to this series as well, like you were talking about, revealing more of his backstory.
I know enough about Ahsoka, and I guess this would be spoiler territory if you haven't seen the Clone Wars, I think.
Yeah.
I know that she leaves the Jedi Order, and I'm assuming that's what you were referencing, is that there's some sort of conflict between her and the Jedi Order, which I will watch and discover, but I kind of already know a little bit. So
yeah,
okay,
yeah. It depends on which way you come to the series. If you come through Rebels, then you have a little bit of information about her already. And yeah, I mean, she's a dramatically interesting. I would say out of all of the characters outside of the movies, she's the most interesting, because she really does develop all different directions throughout the course of the Clone Wars and then into Rebels. And following her, you see someone grow into their own in this world that's so different from ours, but also so very similar in a lot of ways.
There is also a novel written about Ahsoka, set between her time in Clone Wars and her time in Rebels, and I have read that too, and I think that probably gave me some background as well. So
I like that it is Anakin and Obi-Wan, and I think that was very intentional. In these episodes because of their scenes in the turbo lift.
Right. They get their best talking done in the turbo lift.
Yes. And, I love how it is, it's that image from Attack of the Clones that, in the movies, it was Anakin's love that they were discussing or kind of like hinting around. But then, with this one, it's Obi-Wan, and it's really cool that we get that idea set up, in this episode that sort of there's like this hint that Anakin gives, like, hey, so what's up with you guys? Did you have a past? And at the beginning of the Clone Wars episodes, there's always this little like wisdom, like fortune cookie type thing. And for this episode, it's if you ignore the past, you jeopardize the future. So that I think if what would have happened if Anakin knew like what Obi-Wan really went through, and what if Anakin went to Obi-Wan and said, "Hey, this is what's going on in my life. What's your advice?" But he didn't, of course. So, ignoring the past and jeopardizing the future, I got that a little bit with the Obi-Wan Anakin, romantic, vocational situations here.
Well, and you mentioned this earlier too, is this also just, adds a human dimension to Obi-Wan. Like as a Jedi, he's not immune to human emotions and relationships and falling in love and, everything that makes us human. And if only Anakin had decided to open up a little bit.
If either of them had, but they all, they're very, and I think that's one of the hazards of the Jedi as you go through, that you see more and more. That's a hazard that the Jedi have, is that they're very closed off. Their emotions are bad, like this icky thing that they're supposed to completely avoid, rather than just dealing with them and discussing them and then moving on, and so that's, you see the effect that has, basically. And then the Sith is a complete, opposite response, where it's just like, just embrace your emotions, like completely dive into them and do anything you want to. And it's like, come on, guys, there's got to be a middle ground between these two things.
Well, and that's why it's been fascinating to even just look at the Sith and the Jedi and say that actually neither one is fully in line with how we are called to live our lives. Because the Jedi say there is no emotion, there is peace. And yet, if you deny your emotions and suppress them and not talk about them, that is incredibly harmful.
Yeah.
And so is just embracing passion in any form.
Well, and the same thing here, you get in this one, you get the juxtaposition of a completely peaceful character and a character that is a little more bent on war than he probably is healthy being. I think that the Jedi Order as a whole has bought into this war more fully than they should. And that you see that problem kind of developing throughout the course of the whole war. But you have a character that's too peaceful, like has completely removed themselves from any sense of opposing violence. And then you have this character that reacts very quickly to defending himself and anyone around him that he feels is being threatened, almost to the point of not analyzing the situation properly before he does what he's going to do.
Yep.
But it also seems like as they progress through this arc, that they both sort of almost kind of meet somewhere in the middle, just a little bit. Like she starts off as someone who's like an absolute pacifist, and she kind of comes into the middle realm. And he also, I think, probably recognizes that he is a Jedi and meant to be, someone who promotes peace, and maybe is being a bit too violent in his actions, and I think, well, it's at the end of this episode even, and we'll get to it, but the senator, blanking on his name, Senator Merrick is basically having both of them confront the reality. She's holding the gun to Senator Merrick, and Obi-Wan is there with his lightsaber, and he basically tells Satine that if she shoots him, then she becomes a hypocrite. And if Obi-Wan strikes him down, then he's going to be held as a hero to everyone except Merrick. And neither one of them actually respond to that. It's actually Anakin who comes in and
which is one of the best parts of this whole arc.
What? He was going to blow up the ship.
I was reading, I glanced at IMDb at that point, and I need to go back and watch the episode, but someone on IMDb had commented that it's at that point you can actually hear a little bit of the Imperial March playing in the background. Yeah. So
they do that at several points. Yeah, they do that at several points with Anakin, where they have like these little moments where you like see this really dark side to him. You're like, whoa, that was a little more brutal than it needed to be,
And
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of a joke to him almost, and it's like, whoa, that was intense. But and then I also had to pause even before we got to that point. So in the bridge of the ship, he starts that whole series off, and I paused the thing and I said to my kids, "That's not how you make a suicide switch." And they're like, "What?" And I'm like, "You don't make it so that when you push it, it blows up. You make it so that when you let go, it blows up, because then they can't kill you." And they were like, "Oh, that makes sense."
Good lesson, Dad. I'll keep that in mind for my future.
It's just they got to know these things. It's important to know these things.
Oh, cool. Well, we sort of spoiled the end of that episode, but let's jump back to the beginning.
We gave into temptation.
Oh man, we just jumped the gun. Okay, it's okay.
Voyage of temptation. Yeah, so essentially the episode starts off and they're on their way to Coruscant, and Anakin and Obi-Wan are very aware that Death Watch is going to try to assassinate Satine before she reaches the Senate to prevent her from stopping the Republic from sending troops. And so they send their clone troopers off to search for anything suspicious.
Which, by the way, they're on a ship that looks just like the ship from Solo.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
did you pick up on that?
Yeah, I thought that too, and I was like, wait a minute. So, is that a Mandalorian ship? Is that a was it a Senate ship?
Yeah, Senate ship.
Maybe, I don't know.
But it was really swanky.
Yeah, it was red though, wasn't it? It was colored red
in Solo.
Remember? No, in this one.
No, it was like silver.
It was silver, yeah. Because if they're red, then you know they're Republic ships. That's the red was the marking of the Republic. So if it didn't have red markings on it, though, then it was something independent. So that's interesting.
I don't know if this is quite a bit of a stretch or not, but as you mentioned that, wouldn't Darth Maul becomes at some point the head of Death Watch.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So maybe through that connection, he somehow gets a hold of one of these ships, and it's through his criminal syndicate that in Solo, that's where the ship is involved.
Yeah, good thinking.
That's a great point, actually.
Wow.
I really hope that's true because
that's a good. I think it's totally valid. I'm with it.
So
it's totally impressive to me that if that's the case, then the fact that the designers of the movie actually were like, what kind of ship should we make for this guy? And then they go back to the Clone Wars, this random little moment. It's cool.
Yeah. So we get one of the Obi-Wan and Anakin scenes in the elevator. And Anakin asks Obi-Wan about his past with the Duchess, and Obi-Wan just kind of shuts him down. We see the assassin droids escape, and then it kind of jumps back to Satine talking to her staff again about her position on the war. And she says that she opposes the war as an affront to life itself and wants to stay neutral. And we get some dialogue back and forth between Obi-Wan too, because he walks in and he claims that, some would say that the strongest defense is a strong offense. And she replies with, I remember a time when Jedi were not generals but peacekeepers. And Anakin at this point pipes up and says, we are protectors. We fight for peace.
Yeah.
And she calls that an amusing contradiction, which is quite true.
Yeah. Well, I like the fact that Obi-Wan's uniform is reflective of this new stance that he's taken. He's not in the robes anymore. He's in armor. Yep. And he's kind of embraced this. And it really shows here that he's embraced this warlike stance.
Mm-hmm. We then kind of swap back to the assassin droid that was planted there. That it takes out a clone trooper, Mixer, and
Red Eye.
Red Eye, and another brief little moment between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and that's where Obi-Wan opens up just a little bit about his past with Satine and reveals that he had spent a year on Mandalore protecting Satine. Him and Qui-Gon had spent a year protecting Satine from insurgents who had threatened her world, and they were on the run from bounty hunters the whole time. And so that is all that we kind of learn about the past between the two of them. And R2-D2 discovers that there is a problem down below decks, and Anakin decides to take that bullet and go down below decks to figure out what's going on. They find this creepy looking assassin droid and disable
Those things
it.
are awesome. Oh my gosh, those things are awesome.
They're pretty cool. If you're going to make an assassin droid, that's the way to do it.
That's the way to do it, man. And if you've ever in your life experienced trying to shoo a mother spider out of your house, and that experience of all the babies coming off her back and running around crazy, that's and they did that, and I was like, oh yeah, because I think I think, honestly, it might have been that very year that I had that same experience in my house and then watched this, and I was like, oh, that's awful. That's the worst thing.
Well, and then they're getting, like, in their helmets and stuff. It's like, how, like, so confined, like, you can't, what are you going to do? It's, like, in your face, literally.
Yeah. Oh, no. Oh, it's awful. Well, and I love the moment there too between the clones and R2. Like Rex and Cody aren't there when R2 starts trying to tell people that something's wrong, and so the other clones are like, this droid's malfunctioning, and he seems to think there's a problem down here. And then both the Jedi are like, ooh, that sounds serious.
Yeah, I just hate spiders. I would just give up. Ugh.
Oh, those things are great. I was so happy when all the little guys came out of the holes on the top. I'm like, yes, it's like a real spider.
Yeah, so thankfully they managed to destroy it and take out all the little baby ones. And one of the assassin droids heads up the lift up to where Obi-Wan and Satine are, and they are also attacked. And Satine says something really interesting there. Again, it kind of relates to her view as a pacifist, but she says, just because I'm a pacifist doesn't mean I won't defend myself. And then Obi-Wan says, well, now you sound like a Jedi. So, again, there's that, absolute pacifism would say no violence whatsoever, period. But she is not quite that because she's willing to use violence and force to defend herself. So then Anakin realizes that in order to smuggle this droid into the hold, someone in some position of authority must have been behind it, and they pull up the manifest, and it is unclear who is behind it because that particular crate that had the assassin droid is just marked as medical supplies. And somehow it's connected that then it must be one of the 4 senators.
It's got a Senate stamp on it. So that's what they say. It's got a Senate stamp, so it had to have been a senator that put it in.
And Obi-Wan then decides to use that information. He captures one of those little tiny assassin spider droids and decides to use it to see which of the senators was the one who was behind it. And he looks to see which ones the little droid wants to attack and which one it doesn't, because the one that it doesn't attack is the one who would have programmed it. And he walks around the table, and it is revealed that Senator Merrick is the one who had programmed it and is the traitor, who immediately kind of embraces that revelation and captures Satine and heads out with her.
Which, again, we get the sense that Obi-Wan is not on his A game right now.
Yeah,
right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, again, I kept thinking about that, too, because if he's really in tune with the Force, he would have sensed his deception or his intent to capture Satine. But it is what it is, and Senator Merrick gets the upper hand and heads out. And meanwhile, Anakin and the troopers are taking out the final assassin droid and all the little droids down below decks. Merrick contacts Death Watch, and they call for reinforcements, and immediately, and at some point, I must have missed it, they dropped out of hyperspace. Mm-hmm. I think they dropped out of hyperspace, and then Merrick called for reinforcements. And then the reinforcements arrive, and super battle droids board the ship and begin attacking.
Yeah, I think when he takes out the bridge, because he goes to the bridge and immediately shoots everyone, and then he pulls them out of hyperspace, contacts, and then the super battle droids appear. Yep. Which those landing pods are pretty cool, man. They just strike into the hull of the thing and pop open, and there's a bunch of battle droids right there. It's like, oh, that's that's pretty bad.
Yep. So Anakin and the clone troopers are trying to deal with all the super battle droids, and Obi-Wan confronts Senator Merrick on the bridge. And Anakin, at that point, is taking out all the battle droids below decks. And when we go back to Satine and Obi-Wan, we get this revelation between the two of them that Satine expresses her love for Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan reveals that he would have left the Jedi Order if she had asked him all those years ago.
Let's all just
big moment.
Take that in.
I know, right? It's like, what?
Oh, I remember watching that for the first time, and it was just like, your jaw drops. And because, I watched the original trilogy first. And so I saw Obi-Wan as the wise sage who, he is the ideal Jedi. And even in the prequels, he's very loyal to the council, and even though he loves Anakin, he does what he has to do, and so he seems very by the book. So for this to be revealed about his past is really interesting.
But it's still by the book. And that's, I think that's the difference there. That's really interesting, because he's still by the book, where Anakin is not. Anakin wants both. He wants to have both the relationship and the Jedi way. And Obi-Wan is clear. I would have left.
Yeah.
If you had asked.
Yeah. So I mean, to me, the theme of duty and vocation is really evident in their relationship, and Satine and Obi-Wan's relationship, because I think, it was mentioned earlier in this episode that Obi-Wan talks about how Satine took on the task herself of rebuilding Mandalore, that, she was alone. And so to me, it also, the fact that she didn't ask Obi-Wan to leave or even reveal her love for him beforehand kind of indicates that she felt she had a duty to her people, a vocation to be the one to take up the responsibility of rebuilding Mandalore. And perhaps she also, realized that Obi-Wan would have been a great Jedi, and, decided to just keep her feelings to herself. So yeah, I think it's really interesting that at the end of this episode, actually, they end up reaffirming their commitments to the Jedi and to Mandalore, and the way that they end up respecting each other, and the way that they choose to live their life. So, I think that even though it's shocking, learning all of this, and people can kind of write fan fiction and all kinds of stuff about what would have happened. And ultimately, I think that's the message that I take away from it, is that they were both, they took on the responsibilities that were presented to them.
Well, I think for either of them, it would have been a betrayal of who they are at their core to have abandoned that dedication. And that's why I think it's really important as Catholics to go back and talk about vocation in that way, that it's not, you didn't choose to do this. This was something that you were built for. And when you really embrace that, when you really move into it with that full understanding of the core of your being is driven toward this thing, and that drives you toward God, it's a very powerful thing, and it removes that sense of it's limiting on me, or it's not freeing to me to have to commit to this or to be stuck in this way.
Yep.
But it's a full embrace of who you are, and that's what I think both of these characters realize by the end of this series, is that they really were committed to these things. And yes, it was nice to think of other things that could have been, but ultimately that's not who they were.
Well, and it's important to note that there is sacrifice there. That they both had to sacrifice something. They had to sacrifice their feelings for one another and their love and that future that they could have had together. But in order to live out of the vocation that they were called to, which is ultimately more fulfilling than what they had to give up. And that's exactly kind of, what we talk about when we talk about vocations is that, if you live out of your vocations, you're going to be the most fulfilled that you can be on this earth, because you're doing what God has created you for and made you for. And I mean, there's so many connections even between just priesthood and the Jedi, and even the celibacy role and all of that. And so many people, one of the most common questions that I get from non-Catholics is when they find out that I'm a priest Even when I go to Comic Cons, especially, it's like, oh, you're a Catholic priest. Oh, that means you can't have a wife. You can't have kids. And it's like, well, correct. I mean, I made the promise of celibacy, but celibacy is not so much about what I've given up as much as it's put me in a position to be completely free in how I love and love, given to everyone. And sure, I had to sacrifice a specific part of that, the romantic relationship and having a family. But even so, the family that I've gained, on a spiritual level, spiritual sons and daughters and the parish community and, even my immediate family and my niece and nephew. And I haven't really sacrificed a family, but I've gained an awesome family. And that's, again, that idea of vocation of living out of who God has called me to be and who God has called you guys to be, and who Obi-Wan and Satine were meant to be in their particular roles as well.
Yeah, so that kind of goes a little bit with, I mean, the Jedi understanding of like having attachments isn't perfect, but there is that truth kind of to what you were talking about that, if a Jedi were to be married, as Anakin was, he was so fearful for his wife's life that he ended up messing up a lot of stuff and giving in to fear, and living by that fear. And so, yeah, I mean, the idea that, you don't necessarily, if you love someone and you're married to them, you don't necessarily have to be attached to them in that unhealthy sense.
Yep.
But there is that, again, we're talking about the Jedi being extreme. They say, well, if you're going to go there, you're going to have attachments, so just don't do it. That seems to be sort of their way of dealing with temptation. But yeah, I mean, there is sort of that element too. And I think, we've been talking about how Obi-Wan has been off his game. And I really do think that he was distracted because he was so worried about Satine.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I think that's part of what they're trying to tell us here, is that this was something he recognized in himself, that he was developing an attachment to her, and that he moved away from that.
Yeah, because ultimately at this point when Merrick is threatening her with a gun, she pleads with Obi-Wan, if you have any respect for me, please think about all these other people on this ship and don't do anything. So even though Obi-Wan's following them with his lightsaber, he's not taking any initiative in terms of, making a move to swipe her away from Merrick or striking Merrick down. But he is still kind of respecting that. And in other words, I think if Anakin were in this situation, Anakin would have done something rash to save Padme because he was attached to Padme. But Obi-Wan was not completely attached to Satine. And so he was able to kind of think about everybody else on the ship, think about what was best.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the end, Anakin is the one who, I wouldn't say he necessarily acts, well, he probably does act
he could have just cut the guy's
but,
arm off, and that would have been the end of it. I don't know. Like, it's pretty brutal. Like the decision he makes is almost like a puppy, like walking into a situation and going, "Oh, you guys are fighting over this toy. Here, it's mine now." But he killed someone, and that's and it's a big deal. And like both of them are stunned. First off, they're shocked and watching this happen, and Anakin's like, "What? He was going to blow up the ship." And that's the only explanation he gives.
I love how they totally set this up too, to like really underline Anakin's character, because the line that Merrick says is, "Who will strike first and brand themselves a cold-blooded killer?"
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see it happen.
Yeah. But life goes on, and they manage to kind of save the day with that, and they get to Coruscant then at the end of that episode and meet up with Chancellor Palpatine. Yeah, so then that was the end of that episode, and we'll jump right into the third and the final arc of this particular story. And so this is now Satine is going to go talk to the Senate in the hopes of convincing the Senate that Death Watch doesn't represent their entire government, and that they do not need the Republic's assistance. And so, first of all, we have another interaction between Count Dooku and Pre Vizsla, and Count Dooku urges Pre Vizsla to be patient and that be patient for the fighting that is to come, and has Pre Vizsla send an assassin to Coruscant to take out Duchess Satine. And then back on Mandalore, they very quickly realize that Death Watch is assembling and preparing for battle. And the Prime Minister realizes that the people will turn in favor of Death Watch if the Republic sends troops to Mandalore. And so they want to stop that at all costs, and leaves it up to Duchess Satine to do that with the Senate.
And that's the first point where we get to see the depth of her pacifism, of her neutral stance, more than just pacifism, of knowing that if she allows the Republic to step in this way, that it's going to cause more conflict and more strife rather than solve anything.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what she tells the Senate. And Chancellor Palpatine brings up the modified communication of Deputy Minister Jarek, and the deep fakes of the Republic's time.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, it happens so often in the series, the Clone Wars as a whole, where you're like sitting there watching Palpatine play both sides because he can't lose. Like, he can't lose no matter which way this goes. He wins because he's just stirring up conflict, and it's creating more doubt, more distress, more fear, and it's awful and incredible at the same time.
Yeah, a master puppeteer. So he pulls up this communication, and Jarek, modified transmissions, basically says that they need the Republic's assistance to counter Death Watch, and that he claims that Duchess Satine will cause their defeat. And Satine immediately recognizes that something's not right with this, and Jarek is unfortunately killed by Death Watch, so he can't even vouch for anything that he said or didn't say. And Palpatine is, at that point, very much urging the Republic to vote in favor of sending assistance to help. And I put in quotation marks to help. And again, that same sort of deal is that he's just playing the game. He doesn't really care. He doesn't really want to help. He just wants to stir up conflict. And we go back to Obi-Wan encountering Satine afterwards, and they continue to talk about their differing philosophies. And Satine very clearly asserts that the Republic is attempting to force its will upon Mandalore, and she is not happy about it. And Obi-Wan urges he urges her to be a little bit more rational and patient, and she kind of blows that off. She jumps into a transport vessel, which is sabotaged by the assassin that Death Watch sent, and the vehicle, as it's trying to crash at that point, the pilot manages to get to a landing platform where Satine is able to jump off and survive, but the ship and the pilot do not. And they meet up with Chancellor Palpatine afterwards, and since there was no evidence, he tells her that it just must have been an accident. And
the bureaucracy. Wasn't that why he was elected into place to overturn? Was this whole sluggish bureaucracy that was taking everything away from the power of the Senate? I don't know.
Also, Masameda is such a yes man. For those who don't know, Masameda is like that blue guy with horns that's always with Chancellor Palpatine. And throughout this whole episode, you just see him just whatever Palp says, he just goes with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was during this conversation that that they sort of kind of shift their thought, though, and with Satine suggesting that Death Watch is behind this, they get on board with the idea that that if it is Death Watch, it's just increased this fear of Death Watch, and Death Watch's power, and it will just incline the Republic to vote in favor of occupying Mandalore. And Satine didn't know it at the time, but it was actually during that exact meeting that the Senate had an emergency meeting where they voted on this exact issue, and the Senate voted to send troops to Mandalore. So Satine decides to go solo and goes off by herself to meet her contact in the Ministry of Intelligence. And she meets up with her contact and gets a data disk with the full transmission from Jarek. And the contact then is immediately killed by the assassin from Death Watch. And Satine is marked as the suspect in the shooting by the local authorities, and she goes on the run. And Sabine, I keep wanting to call her Sabine every time that I've said, okay, I knew it was going to happen. Satine contacts Obi-Wan for help, and Obi-Wan meets up with Satine, and she gives him the data card with the transmission. And at that point, the Mandalorian assassin finds them, and they fight, and the assassin gets away. And Satine decides to turn herself in to the authorities, to distract the authorities so Obi-Wan can get into the Senate without any interference, in order to give that full transmission to the Senate so they can reverse their decision. And Padme presents that transmission to the Senate, and we see that Jarek actually didn't say that they needed the Republic's assistance, but rather Jarek says that to be successful, they must not get Republic assistance, but they should take care of the Death Watch threat themselves, which completely then foils Pre Vizsla's plans and Count Dooku's plans, and they can't really do anything and are kind of defeated.
Although Pre Vizsla is still convinced that he can win, mm-hmm. And so that I think that's an important point, is that Pre Vizsla is like, well, I can still win, and Dooku's like, yeah, but and then he calls him like, what is the phrase that he used? A neophyte, yeah. A neophyte such as yourself, and it's like, oh man, that's brutal. And but I think that's so telling, because Dooku's playing the long game, mm-hmm. like the really, really long game. And you also wonder in that scene, though, how much he knows of Palpatine's plans, because he's by this point kind of gone off on his own a little bit as well, which is why Asajj Ventress is his apprentice. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm intrigued about how much he's planning on actually winning this war. Or is he still like playing for Palpatine's side, or is he completely rogue? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think you can argue that Dooku is a guy who just does everything in his own favor. Yeah, you know, obviously you want the Chancellor on your side, the Emperor of the Universe to be, you know, so you want him on your side, but I think he's kind of getting to the point where he has enough power to overtake Palpatine, or so he thinks.
Right. Well, and then the Senate votes to reverse their decision, and we're left with, well, we aren't necessarily left with the questions, but they're left with the questions of who was ultimately behind all of these sorts of things. And that is where that story arc concludes. So, after that sprint, there were definitely a number of kind of overarching themes of these episodes, and we've kind of talked about a number of them. And so I kind of wanted to jump back into the pacifism theme just a little bit, because it was interesting. I was reading an article on Catholic thought and just war theory because of the whole nuclear war threat that has been prominent in the recent weeks. And so the author of this article was kind of trying to talk about the Catholic view on just war and what we as Catholics can kind of do. And that was very much in my mind as I was watching these characters kind of play it out on the Clone Wars. And so to just kind of give a very, very brief kind of overview of just war theory, going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, just for your guys' information and our listeners, just war theory deals with the legitimate and moral approach to how we can engage in warfare, or if we should. And so in just war, there are two more or less areas that we look at. And the first one would be referring to the legitimate reasons a state may engage in war. And the second one would be referring to how it must be carried out to remain just. And so St. Thomas Aquinas actually argues for three reasons for a war to be just. And he says that first of all, the authority by which the war is engaged must be legitimate, so a ruler entrusted to the common good. Second, the cause must be just. And thirdly, the one waging war must intend to advance good and to prevent evil. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2309, if you are interested in looking this up, also talks about these sorts of issues, and it lists a number of other criteria as well in determining a just war. And so the Catechism says that first, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on a nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain in order for a just war to be pursued. Number two, all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. Number three, there must be serious prospects of success. And four, the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil eliminated. So something like a nuclear bomb would never be just because the evils that it causes is worse than the evil that would be eliminated. And then finally, in regard to how just war is to be carried out, two crucial criteria there is you cannot kill non-combatants, and two, you cannot use excessive force to achieve the end. And so that's, I know, a super, super brief kind of overview of that, but it was really interesting to kind of apply that to what was going on here because, I mean, case in point, Chancellor Palpatine, the Emperor, however you want to describe him, he is not at all engaging in just war. I was kind of comparing his reasons to Aquinas's three reasons, and technically, he is a legitimate ruler, a legitimate authority entrusted to the common good because he is elected to that position. So he does fit the first criteria, but the cause must be just. Absolutely not. The emperor is not out for any just cause. He's out for his own selfish reasons. And the one waging the war must intend to advance good and prevent evil. And of course, the emperor is not at all interested in advancing the good. So it was nice to put that into perspective, which then told me that, okay, Satine is actually the one who is in the right here as she is trying to stay out of the war. And she, we kind of already talked, she's not an absolute pacifist. She's absolutely willing to use force in self-defense, which is completely moral and correct as well. But she wants to avoid entering this war, which totally is not just. So I would throw that out to you guys and the listeners as just some food for thought and reflection.
And I think as a leader, you can be personally pacifist and still be pro-conflict nation to nation, because you yourself might not favor violence as an answer, but the state itself does sometimes require that in defense of its people. And so that's I think what the just war theory is getting at is we're talking about you don't want to. We're not actively pursuing this. We're saying, okay, because there are no other options, this is the thing we have to do to protect the people that we are in charge of. And I think the best leaders are going to be the leaders that are personally pacifist or personally, and I'm going to throw another term out there, which I think is more fitting for what she's talking about, which is the non-aggression principle, that she's not initiating violence. But if violence is initiated, she does respond in kind, because that's the dialogue has been started that way from someone else. And then it by necessity, it often has to continue that way.
Yeah, she makes a point in, I believe it was the first of these 3 episodes. She says even extremists can be reasoned with. And then Obi-Wan kind of, says, well, if you can hear them over, I don't know, their weapons, basically. But I think, she definitely is the the one who is looking for diplomacy much more than the Republic is at this point. The Republic, even Padme's character throughout the Clone Wars series is a huge proponent of diplomacy. She's always going on diplomatic missions. She in Revenge of the Sith, she even questions, is the Republic really what I think it is? Because it doesn't seem to be looking for diplomacy anymore. So, I think definitely when it comes to the church and being Catholic, especially at this time, it's like, to revisit these themes is really good, and to reflect on, the teachings of Jesus and what the teachings of the church and how we can live those out. And that's all good stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I'll have to add a note to this article that I was reading, because he was making the point that some Catholics want to be absolute pacifists because Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says to turn the other cheek, and that's a valid position to take, absolutely. But an absolute pacifist would say that, I will never use force or violence ever, because it's always wrong. And they would only use the weapons of the Spirit, prayer, fasting, and penance, in order to affect change. And that is a valid position to take. But then George Weigel also argues that just war theory can be reconciled with the gospel because it takes seriously the responsibility to one's neighbor. And the question that he proposes in that, in biblical terms, and I thought this is a fascinating way to kind of look at it, is he says, what should the Good Samaritan have done had he shown up during the robbers mugging the traveler?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that would sort of encapsulate what we are trying to get at in Just War. Like, it is appropriate to use some force out of this responsibility to protect and to save our neighbors. And so that's, kind of all at play here as well.
Cool.
So what
I had one more little thing.
Sure.
Not related to War and Peace, but actually related to the aesthetic of these episodes. The cubism of the Mandalorians is really cool because, first of all, there is a little shout out to Pablo Picasso in Pre Vizsla, his kind of quarters. On StarWars.com, they mention that there is a kind of a redoing of Picasso's Guernica, which is his really famous, huge anti-war painting. And of course, in Pre Vizsla's quarters, it is not anti-war. It is very much, Mandalorians doing their thing. But cubism is cool because I think they chose that for the Mandalorians and this arc, because cubism is about not seeing a subject from one viewpoint, but seeing the subject from multiple viewpoints at multiple points in time. So that's why you see like the eyes and the nose and everything looking weird. That's the whole point of cubism. So, as we were doing that thematically with, War and Peace and even, Obi-Wan and Satine and all these different people, we were seeing different sides of them and different sides of these topics. So I think it was really cool that they picked cubism to express that aesthetically.
Yeah, the art was very interesting, the way that the art played into this whole series, because I think one of the first things you notice when Obi-Wan walks into the throne room is this painting, or I don't know if it's a mural or if it was like a stained glass of the Duchess, and that's like the first thing you see as he walks in, and it's very colorful, it's very pretty, it's very pastoral and serene, and it kind of reflects where she is. And then you have that contraposition with Pre Vizsla's room with that Guernica painting, that Guernica style painting in the background. Very cool, very Spartan.
Any other final thoughts between you two?
Nope.
Okay. Well, I think then that concludes this particular episode. So what did you, our listeners, think of these 3 episodes of the Clone Wars? You can definitely let us know, and so be sure to email us or comment on our Facebook or Twitter page and let us know what you thought. You can always email us any feedback at starwars@sqpn.com, and you can find StarQuest on Facebook at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia and on Twitter at SQPN. And now, of course, we'd like to take a moment and thank our patrons who make it possible for us to create the Secrets of Star Wars, including Peter M., Carl S., Rick H., Adam C., and Jeffrey J. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue the Secrets of Star Wars and all the shows that we do here at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Also, definitely be sure to subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And you can always find us on YouTube at the SQPN YouTube channel. To find any previous episodes of The Secrets of Star Wars, be sure to visit us at sqpn.com/Star Wars. And so we will be back in 2 weeks when we will continue chasing down more of the connections and lore of the Mandalorian culture. And doing so, we will look at the Clone Wars again by going to Season 3, Episodes 5 and 6. So until then, Thomas and Herho, thank you for joining me and sharing the Secrets of Star Wars.
It was definitely a pleasure. Enjoyed it.
And Angela Ciolana, thanks for joining us this evening.
Peace out.
Once again, I'm Father Andrew Kinstetter. Thank you for listening to the Secrets of Star Wars on StarQuest.